Good afternoon. My name is Timothy Jennings-Bey. I'm the founder and the CEO of the Street Addiction Institute, Incorporated. I'm also the director for the trauma response team here in the city of Syracuse. I'm gonna start off, because the work runs parallel, so I'm gonna start off with the trauma response process, and then I'll talk about the street addiction process and how they both came into play. And if you have any questions along the way, just raise your hand. It'll still be 20 minutes, but we want to leave enough time for interface because you may have a lot of questions. I grew up here in the city of Syracuse on the south side of the city, attended public schools, grew up, in one of the poorest neighborhoods in the Syracuse community on the southwest side of the city. Working out of the Southwest Community Center where I grew up and participated in youth programming as a child, I was afforded the opportunity to come back to the community and work in the same community that I grew up in, which made my job a lot easier because growing up I had established relationships in the community and throughout the different neighborhoods in the city of Syracuse. So a number of years ago, about 10 years ago, 10, 12 years ago, myself, Chief Fowler, who's the chief for the Syracuse Police Department, and Helen Hudson, a counselor at large, Helen Hudson, and also the co-founders of Mothers Against Gun Violence. We started the trauma response process in the city. What made us look at the trauma response process, what we were noticing over a period of time. I've been doing this work in the community since 1996. So I kind of saw the handwriting on the wall where things had the potential to spiral out of control to, and 1 year later, in 1997, it did. So you understand that a lot of things you may see in the news or on the newspaper came from a situation in 1997, and it's still carrying on to this day, that level of conflict. So people mistake things, they call it gangs or what have you, but once the RICO prosecutions came here to our city, where RICO stands for Racketeering Influence Corrupt Organization Act, that was created in the 1970s for mobsters and their organizations. Once they applied that to here in the city of Syracuse on the south side of the city, it was the first time in U.S. history that the RICO law was applied to a geographical location. It wasn't just for the organization, it was attached to the land. So now, years later, you can have young people grow up in that same neighborhood and their activity could catapult them into a RICO prosecution. But one interesting thing they found out during RICO, that Syracuse gang structure or the conflict is not organized like in other cities where they have leaders, shooters, so on and so forth. So the leadership didn't exist once they found out in the court proceedings. So the conflicts that we see today, about 65 to 80% of it is from 1997, which I'll talk about the language dynamic, why it's still going on to this day. What we were noticing after a period of time from 1996 moving forward, that every time we went to a crime scene, the victims of the crimes were getting younger and younger, and the perpetrators of the crime were getting younger. One particular night in the city, on the south side of the city, on the block that I grew up on, a 16-year-old kid was shot. It was a multiple shooting. It was 3 of them shot. Unfortunately, one of them lost his life. The other 2 are injured. 16-year-old kid. But at that time, it was about 8, 9 shootings going on throughout the city. So we would leave one crime scene, go to another crime scene, go to another crime scene. So somehow we end up back at the original crime scene. Now, what was interesting and disturbing at the same time, when we got back to the original crime scene, there was a little girl about 13, 14 years old sitting on the sidewalk crying when we left hours before. When we came back, she still was on the sidewalk crying, with people walking over her or walking around her. So we got together, Helen and the chief, and said we have to do something about this dynamic, because outside of the yellow tape, there are thousands of psychological victims who are witnessing these horrific acts of violence, and they're being traumatized. So we have to set systems in place to help with that issue. So that gave birth to the trauma response team. So what we did was created a 3-tier process where my phone and other team members' phone on a 24-hour basis, like was mentioned, is hooked to the 911 center. So if a call comes out, it'll give the description, the location of what's going on in the city, the level of injuries. So if it's critical, life-threatening, or a homicide, I activate a phone tree and we go right to the crime scene. The reason that we styled it that way was so we could act as a liaison between the police department and the community, because we know historically that's a stressed relationship. And in a time like that, emotions are all over the place, even for police officers. Because I don't care what profession you have, it's not normal for you to see a human being destroyed that way, right? Everybody was born under the canopy of peace. We learn to become violent. It's not, I don't care if you're a police officer, if you're doing the work that we're doing, it's gonna leave an impression on your psyche to see individuals like that. Especially for us, because a lot of the times the young people, when we get to a crime scene, we know these young people. We know their families. So it's always a cross connection based on the relationship. And sometimes it's our family members when we get there. So you really have to keep your game face on. So we act as a liaison between the police department and the community, kind of acting like an information highway. That's the first level. And like I said, sometimes you'll get to the crime scene before the police get there to set the tape up. So you could walk up individuals maybe deceased, riddled with bullet holes, stabbed, the whole nine. I've seen the worst that this city has to offer on that level. That's the first level. The second level is we respond to Upstate Hospital. We have a memorandum of understanding with Upstate, because when we took the program to Upstate, it was an easy sell. They had the video footage of people showing up from different neighborhoods at the same time. And needless to say, all hell could break loose. People don't get shot on schedule. Things happen. People concerned about their loved ones, they show up to the emergency room exit. So we act as a liaison between hospital staff, whether it's the social work department, emergency department, SPD, or Upstate police department. And we act as a liaison between hospital staff and community too, because I don't know when the dynamic started, but now when people get injured or killed, hundreds of people could come to the emergency room exit and just stand outside the hospital waiting to hear the news of their loved one. And I know it's out of sincere concern, but it shifts the dynamic of day-to-day hospital operations. So what they'll end up doing, because the shooter still may be at large, the hospital goes on lockdown, right? So when the hospital goes on lockdown, you really have to be sick to gain entrance, because they're trying to figure out who's who and who they need to let in if somebody needs to see the deceased or give the hospital certain information about the individual. And also, too, I think they just changed it as of recently. The emergency room is hooked to the pediatric. So you'll have people getting out of cars or out of their cabs with sick children walking into this street dynamic that they know nothing of. And that can be intimidating for anybody. I don't care what walk of life you come from, to see that volume of people, and you have to navigate through that to get into the emergency room. And then the third level of that is the follow-up process, which is done large in part by Mothers Against Gun Violence, to make sure people who suffer these losses get plugged into the necessary resources that they may need throughout Onondaga County or the city, which is difficult because historically, so-called African-American communities, we don't participate in mental health activities or counseling. As you see, it said, creating a therapeutic community, right? We try to move people to that realm of therapy and getting help. And we wouldn't tell anybody to do something I haven't done myself. Because out of my pain, this is how street addiction came into play, how I created this dynamic in the midst of all this chaos. Street addiction was created because I was taking a class in alcohol and group work a number of years ago. And Professor Scholl, she works up here in the School of Falk. She was teaching the class. And after the class one day, I got enough nerve to say to her, I understand the course material, but I have a different feeling, right? I have something else is pulling on me. So I explained to her a little bit what was going on. And in her kind, brash way, she just said, well, do something about it then, right? So I didn't take that the wrong way or anything. I just went back among my peers, start asking questions, start meditating, start reading. And then street addiction, I came up with the concept. The streets have an addictive nature, just like cocaine, alcohol, gambling. People who are reared in that process, whether it's an individual or your family dynamic, people are in need of a rehabilitation process. The young people that we see and we work with day to day who go to our public schools, you can't educate a child that grows up in this dynamic in a normal sense. And you'll see why when I get to the maps that we created as well, the system of trauma mapping. So we have to create an alternative means to educate them. But first they have to be debriefed from all the trauma, the abandonment, the grief, the loss. And I'm not talking about abandonment just in the sense of family not being there. Sometimes that may be the issue. I was having a conversation with a young man yesterday that I know over a number of years. And I said to him, and he knows this dynamic just like I do you know what works on us in our spirit and in our psyche? If you're driving somewhere with somebody you played marbles with and went to elementary school with, and then their blood is splattered on you from a shooting, and you got to drive this person to the hospital, drop them off at the emergency room, and leave them, you'll never be the same again. Because now you have to go back before the family because you have to go through that whole process, right? So those feelings of abandonment, right, in this dynamic, that's just one small part of it. And we have a lot of young people walking around that, have to carry that burden from day to day. So the goal of this work was to create a rehab facility where you could bring individuals and families in and debrief them and decode the street language, because that street language is intoxicating and it moves people to a state of trance. So in essence, when you work with them, you sound like Charlie Brown teacher. They'll look you right in the face and say, yes, ma'am, yes, sir, I understand, but they're in a trance. And you can't talk to people in trance, right? Addiction moves you into a trance. It introduces you to a whole different lifestyle, a way of life, mannerisms, language, which eventually is going to lead to behavior. So I'm going to move through this fast, just so time and question. I'm going to go back to this, which we're big on. The poverty of vocabulary should be discussed with the same passion as child hunger. And I always talk about this. Children reared in poverty or families reared in poverty, they're 35 million words behind children reared in middle-class families and upper-class families. 35 million words by the time they're 5 years old, right? Language shapes reality, right? Language shapes your reality. So this poverty of vocabulary is serious. So if you're reared in poverty, by the time you're 13 years old, you have a standing vocabulary of about 2,000 words, let's say. Now, once you introduce Facebook and texting and shorthand and, all these different media devices, that vocabulary drops fast to about 75 to 150 words. Nobody in this room can define a sound reality for me and express how you feel with 75 to 150 words. Almost impossible. But one language that's universal is physical. You slap me, I'll slap you back. That's an understanding. And the language barrier is off the table at that point. So you can't define reality with that short range of words. So what will happen to you is you'll start to operate from the part of your brain which they call the reptilian brain, right, where the spinal cord and the brain meets. You can't train alligators or crocodiles to roll over or play dead or tell them to sit. They don't respond to language. They respond to sensory perception. You splash the water or you stomp, sound vibrates out and they move. So these young people reared in this dynamic, giving instruction, they're not going to respond. They're operating from their reptilian brain. They're in a trance and they're in survival mode. So what you deem as morality or you deem as success is off the table. Because where we from is significance over success. I don't care about graduating from your schools. I don't care about your jobs, none of the alike. Because in that 75 to 150 word vernacular, I've created a time and space for myself, right? And outside of that, nothing really exists. So this is why young people can become complacent, because Ayanna Van Zant said it best. Your eyes will adjust to the level of deficiency before your face. Meaning things that's abnormal, you'll see it as being normal. So you have young people reared in this dynamic and tell them to go to school. Now, school historically is created for you to sit in the chair, sit still, get instruction from the teacher, interface, and participate. But if I'm reared in this dynamic, I need some noise going on. Can't come in here and sit still. So what you see children do is try to shift the paradigm to the classroom to validate their existence. I'm here and I need some attention, because as you see we move forward, the attention, that could be a moving floor. And like I said, by the age 5, children who live in poverty are exposed to 30 million words less than children who live in middle class to upper class families. Now, this is a system that I created with the rest of my team called trauma mapping. What I wanted to know was the effect psychologically that gunshots have. Do you know what it's like 5 years old, 6, 7, 8, up until your preteen years and into early adulthood, that you hear gunshots every day, sirens every day? Some of them reported, some of them not reported. So I wanted to look by zip code. If somebody came right here now outside the School of Maxwell and let a pistol off, let 6 or 7 rounds in the air, none of us will ever be the same, because everybody will respond to that trauma differently. Some people will go into a shell. Some people will become aggressive. You don't know how people respond, because that has to do with DNA, your biology and what environment you were reared in. So by zip code, everybody can see this map, right? Syracuse City School District had a problem with suspensions, so much so that the federal government had to come in to say that African-American children, civil rights were being violated for the suspension rates. Now you see the map here is color-coded. All of these dots you see on this map are gunshots. Shots fired, and this is from 2010 to 2015. These are all gunshots. Shots fired, people injured, and homicides. Now, the interesting thing is, we see north, south, right? And these gun clusters here. Whoops. We have elementary schools that sit in the midst of this. We have high schools that sit in the midst of this. Do you know what the challenge is in here to walk to school and to walk from school? Just in this dynamic. Now, we guesstimate that children who go here and grow up in this and go to school, some of them are diagnosed as ADHD. But trauma, the effects of trauma, have some of the symptoms, the same symptoms of ADHD. So what do you think will happen to a child if you put them on medicine and they grow up in this? Not a good result. That's the suspension. ELA scores. We just talked about the reading and the vocabulary. Same thing, right? And then the math scores. Low math scores, the same thing. Nobody's addressing this dynamic, right? Which leads me to believe that I know that even the so-called leadership, they're in a trance induced by a death culture. Drive through the community, you don't see billboards with children that graduate, even though they never talk about the other 50%. They always talk about the 50% that dropped out. But what about the children who make it through here? Right? So we'll take questions or any comments or burning desires. I'll say it gotta be one question.
Hi, I worked for Hillside Work Scholarship Connection last year.
Mm-hmm.
And we started talking about this problem with trauma with our students here in Syracuse. And we were struggling because we were an academic program to convince the higher-ups that what these students really need is help with trauma and counselors. And we found that even the schools don't have enough counselors. Are you involved in working, like, getting more counselors in school, or?
Yeah,
Anything
yeah.
to that effect?
Yeah, we are, but we're trying to infuse our frequency into a system that's been running for 30, 35 years. Which, you can't turn an ocean liner around overnight. But we are at the table, we're having a dialogue, and we are in process. Because the same information we presented to district officials from the administration down to principals, teachers, so they do know what's going on. Because you could be the greatest teacher in the world, you can't teach in this dynamic. Like it's not gonna come through. Other things have to be put in place. We're not even talking about, since 1996, we've been tracking with the mothers, and there's been 360, 70 murders since that time. One murder affects 6 people in one household. And then once that spirals out, you're looking at thousands of people traumatized in an 8 to 10 block radius. So that's a lot of pressure, right, on young people and families. So yeah, the district knows, and they're making steps to do something about it.
Actually, when I hear the word, thank you. My name is Badr. When I hear the word trauma, it pops in my mind the rehabilitation programs and rehabilitation centers and expertise and things like that. Especially, I came from Egypt, and I've seen a lot of things like.
Yeah.
But actually, it's not that intense even in Egypt. So have you thought in sort of organizing or making rehabilitation programs, or seeking experts that coming here and use your connections and relationship among these people, so you can persuade them into the importance of such programs?
Right. Well, that's a large part of our work, to get people to recognize. Syracuse University has been very gracious to us and helpful in that process. We have a little small office space at Peck Hall down on Genesee Street to try to get people to understand, but we need it on a bigger scale. Like you're talking about a rehab facility where you take people through certain curriculums, certain activities, and try to get them outside of the environment. So that's still in play. So that's part of our dialogue day in and day out, to get people to move on that.
I wanted to kind
But
of
it's,
talk this
been
question.
extremely
Hi, my name is
difficult.
Arnett Haygood-El. I'm the community relations person with TRT and the associate director for street addiction. And what you're talking about, what's your name? That's it. When you start talking about individuals in impoverished neighborhoods, a lot of resources are put that way. So a lot of people really don't care about these children in these gun clusters, or these people that are killing each other or shooting each other or going to jail, so to speak. We know that America locks up over like 2 million people, right? And that's not saying that, and a lot of these people are from impoverished communities, right? It's not saying that people from other communities don't commit crimes. We just commit more visible crimes, right? White individuals commit more crimes that's not seen, right? Embezzlement, white collar crimes. So again, when you say like, why can't we put the resource behind it? They are not there because don't nobody really care, right? What's going on with this particular dynamic? This particular dynamic run whole systems. We also work with the juvenile justice, Onondaga County juvenile justice programs, and from 13 to 17, they have about 150 individuals and an 86% recidivism rate, where these 13 to 17-year-olds are coming back into the system within a year, 6 months, right? So these individuals are kind of running whole systems, right? If they weren't doing what they were doing, I could be doing something else, right? I don't have to have this job. We got a whole other thing we could be doing. But they run whole systems of parole, probation, incarceration, family court, whole systems. If they weren't doing what they're doing, they'd have to make something happen because a lot of money would be left out of the economy, right? So in saying that, poor people always had that challenge here. And when you say it's not that intense, for us, it's very intense, especially when you have to grow up in it. You know,
No, he said it the other way. He said it's not that intense in Egypt.
Oh, okay,
He
sorry,
said
sorry.
this is intense.
That
He
is,
did. He said,
yeah, I'm sorry I got that wrong.
Yeah.
If I would have knew now, you wouldn't have hurt my mouth.
yeah, this is intense.
I'm sorry.
Yeah.
But this is very intense. And you know, not to minimize the side in the refugee camps in Egypt. Any type of trauma is not it's not conducive to our human development, right? As human beings, and I think society, and you know, especially when you talk about poor people, you know, we lost the capacity, I don't know, somewhere along the line to hug each other, to care about each other. You know what I mean? It's all about the money. It's all about status and who got what and title. And we lost something along the way where just that human piece has just got murky. You know what I mean? And I think we in SAII we trying to bring that back. You were talking about I guess I want to speak to your question too about introducing mental health services into the schools. Schools never had mental health services, right? Teachers,
Not for us.
teachers, they'll tell you quick, we're not social workers, but you are, right? Police will tell you quick, we're not social workers, but you are. Anybody that works with people, you're a social worker, right? From teachers, from the janitor in the school, police, judges, probation officers, parole officers, COs, that's correctional facility guards, they're all social workers. But you know what? Don't nobody want to step into that role, right? They want to separate that role, but you can't because you deal with people. You deal with people in society. So you have a obligation. Well, actually, you don't. To make their lives better.
And I'm glad he
alleviate the
said
stress.
that because we know that the number of the poverty that's in Syracuse, the rates, they say we're number one in the country. You know, African American communities, Latino communities. What's not talked about often on the other side of that is the segregation that comes along with the poverty, right? When you start to redline certain neighborhoods and, you know, different districts and the like. If you ever go on Syracuse.com, my people don't like me looking at it because it's filth. But if you ever go on there when something happens, when a shooting takes place, and the comments that come from the community, it give you a kind of idea of where we live at, the consciousness. But on that other side of the fence, when they see people shoot with no regard to human life, this is a response. Like, those people are animals. How can they do that? How can that happen day in and day out? So that type of language, you start to dehumanize people. Once you make people objects, it's easy to turn a blind eye. You don't hear their cries, right? You don't hear the moans. You like he said, you don't even care. It's not my children. It's not my community. And until we move past that, this dynamic always going to exist. Because if it's resources on the other side, who's reaching out to people in this dynamic to help shift it, right? So that's always going to be an issue in this line of work if we don't make this a human situation.
First of all, thanks for a great presentation. I have two questions about recognition. Mm-hmm. Do the people you're rehabbing recognize that when you operate out of the amygdala, lizard brain, a lot of the operation you're doing is not out of fight, but out of fear?
Right.
So first, do those folks realize that or recognize that? And then second, do the politicians and folks that I hope that you guys are dealing with, do they recognize that a lot of the maps that you guys are showing are a result of public policy?
I'm gonna go answer. I don't think so. I don't think that they recognize this is. They don't tie it to public policy, which you really can't separate it, right? And the number of guns that come in and come out, and we had those conversations with some senators and the like along the way. And then that first question, fear drives this whole culture, right? And what we know, like I always say, people mistake fear for ignorance. Give you a prime example. You could have a family that has lost people on that sliding scale, nieces, nephews, little cousins, neighbors who are like family. The children that's left in this dynamic gets into a fight at school. You'll see the parents and adults come to the school to fight with the children. Now, on the outside, you may be looking at it and say, that's ignorant, they should know better, or whatever opinion you put to the situation. But what you're witnessing is that dynamic of fear, because people in this dynamic have made up their minds. We're not burying no more children. That's it. Enough is enough.
Yeah. You got some people, some families that, some mothers hold guns for their children. You probably think that's kind of out of the loop. But again, it's all about fear, because I want to see my kid come home. I'd rather him shoot somebody than him get shot.
Which is the ultimate question. How do you parent in a war zone? When I have a 14-year-old kid and they're in their preteens, when they want to shake and get loose a little bit, oh, Dad, Mom, going to the party.
No, you ain't.
And you hug them. And then your subconscious mind, I might not see him again because of this.
Well, how do you
Or, no, you're not going to the party. You sit here and the house becomes a prison. That energy has to go somewhere. Then they start sneaking out of windows, lying to you, because the social dynamic and the public policy is driving the culture. So how do you parent in a war zone? How do you educate in a war zone, right? What do love look like in a war zone? Because me holding a gun, I love you. If you need it, just come get it. See, and that's how things could get misconstrued and get out of order, so to speak. But you really can't have an opinion unless you rear the child in this process. Prime example, disturbing. Makes me sick every time I think about it. We working in the school and doing something about it. You have right down this hill children who go to Dr. King Elementary School. The school goes to 5th grade, so that's kindergarten to 10, 5 years old to 10. The school is right across the street from a housing project that has a history of this dynamic going back to that 1997 I talked about. Gunshots going out the school, people have shootouts. You have 5 and 6 year old children that have to hide in cubbies or get under desks. Then after the shot stop, okay, everybody sit back in your chair. Let's go get your coloring books back. What the hell? Like, you think those children don't know what's going on? We tell teachers all the time, there's no way you can work with this population and not experience secondary trauma. So now, especially when you get to high school, because those teenagers will try you. Because in this dynamic, some of them, over 50% of them never had a chance to be a child. They had to take on adult roles. So when you put them in a situation to be a child, it's gonna be some friction. And when that friction comes about, some of the teachers will say, well, come on, they put their dukes up. That's that secondary trauma that they're experiencing. Because the language that they're sitting in the middle trying to conduct business, trying to educate, the things those teachers hear, the things that they see. Anything you eat with your eyes, it just don't go away. It's not cartoons. It moves back to the subconscious and it sits there and festers, right? Until something reminds it, and then it'll come to the front of your mind. So every dynamic in our community or every institution that works with this population have to be careful of that secondary trauma unless you shut off And you say that's their problem. I got my own problems. I don't want to have anything to do with that. And more times than often, that's what happened. And that's what Arnett is talking about. People don't care, right? They don't care on that level. And we take the approach. We're not going to get this twisted. I'm not waiting for Superman. But I already know this Gilligan's Island. Ain't nobody coming. Like, we don't put all the bottles in and send out all the smoke signals. Nothing is coming in return. So I say, yo, let's manipulate the resources on the island, right, to validate our existence, right? So no help is coming. We understand that. Right? And it doesn't bother or move us one way or another. Because at the end of the day, those people, I don't see those people at 3 o'clock in the morning or when we got to bury those children, when we got to go to these funerals, funeral after funeral. I don't see those people. It's not personal. Like, you have your community you taking care of, and we should be taking care of ours as men. You can't accept other people to come clean up a mess. Basically, that's up to us. But if you get in the way of that, it's going to be friction from this side. Because now I understand you're trying to hustle off of our pain, our trauma, and our misery. Oh, that's what we call the white coats. They come in, oh, we have the solution. No, you don't. No, you don't. No, you don't. Not unless you grew up in this dynamic and understand the psyche and you're attached to it. Outside of that, the hustle is a hustle. And we recognize that for what it is too, which we have those situations along the way too, because people don't expect us to be this honest about the situation. But how can I not be? Like, you think after we come home from the hospital, 3, 4 in the morning, looking at a teenager with his chest cracked open with the device that I'm just gonna go turn to Nickelodeon? Nah, I had plenty sleepless nights. I don't know what I'd do without coffee. Plenty sleepless nights.
Well, there are, like, in all this chaos, there is, some kids are resilient.
Yeah,
we talk
a lot of them.
There are a lot of protective factors. I think Noble talked about, language, exposure, right? Family, encasement, protection. So we do, because out of these same communities, we have football players, we got kids that go to SU, we got high school graduates, we have Gates Millennium Scholars, okay? So again, but I think one young life loss is way too many. And now you got parents burying their children, right? And that's just unheard of in any tradition, right? But I'm here to tell you that this dynamic is, what you're seeing is just Syracuse, right? Imagine the numbers in Rochester. Imagine the numbers in Buffalo. Imagine the numbers in Dayton, Ohio, Cleveland, Detroit, Chicago. So this conflict is not something that's just central to Syracuse. It's central to any urban community, not just in the United States. Imagine what's going on in Kingston, Jamaica, in Rio, right? So this is in London. So this is a international problem, right? The same type of urban neighborhood violence, some of it stemming from different angles, right? Some political, some, like he said, intergenerational, stemming back, some gang, some economics, some political. But we still have this same type of dynamic, and we have children that are growing up in this dynamic. That, this stuff, again, when he said when you're growing up in it, this stunts your development, right? This hinders your development. So they can guarantee out of this, they can build some more prisons. Prisons can be built. Prisons ain't going nowhere, right? We could build more jails. Out of this, police can ask for more money for more cars and bigger guns. Just out of this dynamic, right?
Any other questions? We got one.
Well, we had Mr. Swords.
one.
Had his hand up for the longest. Go ahead.
Well, I really appreciate. Okay, thank you. Sorry. I really appreciate your sharing not only the systemic perspective, which I think is key here, and the reality that, you know, even if it was some resources coming to Gilligan's Island, it would be hard to make sure that trust could be built together. It's almost like we need a common language to be able to talk about trauma and resiliency so that everybody can work together and that we can have some teamwork developing among people who trust each other. I see a couple places where that is starting to happen. I don't know if you know Roxanne Hill, who is now heading up the new Juvenile Justice Project's clinical aspect, where they're trying to make it possible for families who are affected by poverty and violence and who have a young person who is in the juvenile justice system to get some kind of counseling support in their home and teamwork with their family. So that's at the family level. And by the way, I think there is one outfit in the schools that I would say is actually doing a good job with individual kids, and that is the Student Assistance Program, where in each school they have a person that kids can go see. They won't talk to their parents without the kids' permission. They won't talk to the teachers without the kids' permission. So that Student Assistance Program is also available. But I really think that we need to get together a larger team for the community, including, you know, with your input moving it forward, yours and Helen's, to make sure that everybody's on the same page and addressing the system problems. And, you know, I would, the Greater Syracuse Hope effort, where they're trying to end poverty, is going in the right direction, and yet I think we need to somehow find a way to change the systems that brought the redlining in the first place, and also that are continuing to profit off of this, like you said, when the police get more money and they build more jails. You know, there's got to be something to change both the poverty and the violence, and to work with the resiliency that is developing in here. So I really appreciate your you know, the degree of hope that is behind what you're talking about, and that hopefully we can stay connected with the people who are trying to do something about it, like yourselves.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Thank you, Peter.
We had a question. We had a question right here.
Let me talk to Peter's.
No, let's get to the questions
Okay,
first, and then go back around.
Go ahead.
Well, thank you for coming. I grew up in Atlanta, and I definitely knew people who were dealing with this stuff. And in high school, yeah, it kind of came out where kids were graduating, couldn't read, they were just being pushed up through the system, because this kind of like aged out. Do y'all try to work with any of those kids at all to try to help expand their vocabulary, help them have the language to deal with these kind of issues? And I think y'all mentioned the high school to prison pipeline a little bit. Do you see that a lot? Do you see that increased instances in these darker blue areas where kids are having more issues as a result of the trauma?
Then we had another question in the back.
Thank you again. This is the second time I've heard your presentation, and it's equally powerful, if not more so, the second time. So thank you for coming. I guess mine is the obvious question. I really take your point about the white coats swooping in and saying, okay, this month it's bridges from poverty, and next month, right? Because I know this city has had, how many expensive programs and projects over the years. So I'm asking the obvious question. When you advise the mayor and the school district and Frank Fowler, what do you suggest outside of the good work you're doing, helping people deal with these traumas from violence? What do you have larger, more systemic advice that you're giving to the people in power?
You want to answer his question, and we'll go back
I want
around.
to answer both of those questions.
And then I'll get to his question.
I'm glad you said that, because that was kind of my segue into what Peter had asked. We had tons of programs in Syracuse. Programs is the problem. right? Especially with people in poverty, right? You have people come in your life, right? Say they're gonna help you fix a problem, and you know what? The money out of the program, they're gone, and you right back where you started, right? Dealing with the problem. That's why we had to think in terms of institution, right? This is the Street Addiction Institute, right? This is an institution. So we want to start thinking long term, right? Because we understand programming, people darting in and out of your life. We want to be here for the long haul, right? We need institutions in these communities that's going to do the work, that's going to build a relationship, because the only way, again, that's this stigma with mental health is real in African American community. It's real. It's not something that people just don't want to come do. It's real. People don't want people in their business. We have individuals that are have mental health issues. I think we all have mental health issues. If you put us on the scale from 1 to 10, some of us fall on this end, and some of us fall in the middle. But again, in this dynamic, you have undiagnosed generational mental health issues, right? So when we start to say that in the community, people are not forthwith because we've had so many encounters with social workers, public health nurses, police, these different people. And it's always been a conflict, right, in the community between, because some social workers are worse than cops. They knock on your door, you pull up a barrier, right? Teachers and parents, all these conflicts, right? So we need to build an institution where we can kind of be a liaison in between that to tell people it's okay. So as kids growing up in this, say it's okay to get counseling. And at the same time, being consistently visible, right? Not darting in your life and darting out of your life, right? Because they've had generations of that, right? So when people come from systems, it's automatically wall up. So what our power, let me just put it that way, our power and our influence in the community comes from our relationships that we have, right? On this level and on this level, right? And what we're trying to do, we're trying to build on these relations on this level and this level so we can kind of bring it together. But that's going to take time, right? So we cannot think program. We can't think when the money runs out, or if we don't have any money, we got to stop doing the work, right? Because the work, we just got money for this work. We've been had this thought since the 90s. We just got funded for this work a couple of weeks ago, right? We're just getting money for this work. We've been doing this without money, right? So again, we're thinking institution. That's what's gonna change the dynamic. If we can get these young adults to grow up to be healthy adults mentally, this thing will change itself, right? This dynamic will change itself.
Now, what Arnett is talking about, once again, when you talk about an institution, you're talking about something that's generational. To get people here to move, to put a dollar amount into a situation is extremely difficult, right? Because for one, you're talking about people reared in poverty who may not necessarily been trained to understand the value of a dollar and how you follow your money. People in poverty spend their money and walk away from it. They don't follow the money, so they don't hold people accountable. So institutions should outlast you at some point in the work. Institutions come into play where you get private donors, right? Grant programs and stuff like we say, you got 3-5 years if you're lucky. And then it's back to the drawing board, you have to write again, right? So an institution is you have to invest in your own. So even to get people to understand that on that level, because it's a new language, right? There are no long-standing institutions that have an effect in the community. It's all pockets of programming, right? And they act like gangs. when it come to the grant. But then you turn to the children and say, oh, you shouldn't act like that. But they display the same mentality. They just do it through fax machines and emails. Your question about the prison, school to prison pipeline, and in the darker areas, the language dynamic. A lot of the young people don't know what's working on them. Right? This is why we try to create this dynamic to debrief them, because they think that standard vocabulary is regular. Right? Because that's their environment. That's what they're reared in. So when you come talking outside of that, you know, they start kind of looking at you funny unless you could play in those different houses, bring it up here and then bring it back down. Because if you stay up here for too long, you'll lose them. Right? So a prime example, in one of the high schools, to talk to your point, you have a lot of young children that were socially promoted. And in that, 80% of the freshman class failed. So what you think the graduation rates could be potentially? Went in the Justice Center before, our county holding facility here. It was about 420 some odd inmates. Nobody had a GED or high school diploma. Right? So that goes back to my original point, significance over success. If somebody, the household you're reared in, if education is not important because they've been traumatized by their educational experiences and the social dynamic, your chances are very slim that you'll get hold to it and run the rest of the race and come out the right way. Behavior is modeled.
Risk factor.
Right? Gorillas can't teach lions how to hunt.
I think we can take two last questions, then we'll give them room to wind up.
Hi. So you talk a lot about working with trauma on the streets, but there's also this counter dynamic of these youths going into the correctional facility where, according to the recent lawsuit, they're not receiving the right amenities, we could say, and access to education. Have you thought, or are you working with these populations? Because getting them an education and trying to get them out of the system would also have a tremendous effect, obviously, on the dynamic outside the prison and lessening those ties. Could you maybe speak a little bit to that, if that makes sense?
Yeah. We're part of the Juvenile Detention Alternative Initiative, JDAI, and they're doing a lot of juvenile
Reform,
juvenile detention center reform. Like, so they're finding out that some of these kiddie jails are worse than the adult jails, and these kids that are coming out of these juvenile systems are primed for the adult system, right? So they're trying to. We're on the actual initiative, making recommendations, going into our local place, looking at it, see how they're treating youth. You know, youth are not supposed to be shackled. We're looking at, you know, raising the age to 18, because again, you know, you're correct that a lot of services are not being dealt with. Now, when you talk about education in this Syracuse City School District, their hands are kind of off. Like when a kid goes into incarceration or goes get detained, they're kind of pulling back from that when they should be in that process. Noble always talks about school and community being one, because these kids, you know, you only can hold a kid in a juvenile detention center for about 60 days, right? Unless they had a murder or a Class A felony, right? Which is usually not the case. They're there for not doing what their parents saying. They're there for running away. They're there for stealing a car. You can't hold them forever. But when they do make that decision on that level, the school district kind of backs off of them when they shouldn't, because these kids are going to return back into the community, right? So we are working on that initiative.
There was one more question.
Yeah, thank you guys so much. I loved your talk, and I wish there were more of these types of talks happening at SU. Anyway, I was hoping that you could maybe come back to the title of your talk, which is Structural Violence in Syracuse. And I guess I'm urging you to do that because I think underlying what you've presented is the argument that this interpersonal violence is really rooted in a form of structural violence. So I guess I'm curious to hear how your therapeutic model and your focus on mental health would combine with efforts to address the structural problems like the lack of jobs and the racially concentrated poverty and therefore like how this kind of community-based intervention would in fact join forces with other kinds of social movements and other kinds of social interventions.
Well, we know when you think you can conduct business here? The job not the issue. Like we have situations where we put young people in jobs. It's the mentality. We got people right now that won't take a job at DPW because they can't go in a certain neighborhood. We had people shot at while they're out taking trash on the back of trucks and have to run and duck. So the reality is real. So when you talk about structural violence, whether it's with the police or the economics or the poverty, first we have to stop the conflict before we can conduct any educational business, bring people into the community to do business. We have a grocery store being built on South Ave right now. Because what if you're going in the store with your child and that is a RICO in a gang territory and bullets start flying? So this dynamic affects everything, structural from the top down all the way to the bottom. So we got to kind of create a situation where we could find out what the conflict is about and help make people feel whole again, to re-educate people in how to feel again, right? Because this will make you cold. This will make you cold. And we talk to this same talk we have with police officers, we have with medical staff, probation, parole, all of those systems that's in place because they're tied to this dynamic, whether they want to be or not. And that goes back to what Arnett talked about. When you talk about poverty, like I said earlier, and the segregation that runs parallel with it, you have people who work in this dynamic but don't feel like they're part of it. So they come in, get their paycheck from the city, extract resources, and go back out, right? And they don't participate consciously outside of the workday in this dynamic. So no, we're not a Syracuse community. That sounds cute when you talk about language and the like, but we're very separated, a very separated community.
A lot of conflict.
And that came out, and we had those discussions at the Hope Initiative, because we have to create the dialogue. Like we have to talk about it. There's no other way around it. Or we're gonna keep continuing to see systems break down all over the place. And you know what's gonna continue to happen? The blame game. Right? It's not our fault, it's those people. It's them. And when you get into those and them and I, and you start to individualize consciousness, the gap is gonna get wider and wider and wider, right? So even, for example, it's not Syracuse University's job necessarily to come into the community, but at least they were receptive to bring us from the community up into this dynamic. Some people say, no, we don't even want to hear it. It's not our problem. Like, deal with it. You know, that's on you, and that's the reality of it. So the structural stuff, I think it'll take care of itself along the way, the more dialogues we have, and, you know, getting politicians to move with legislation and policy, which is very hard to do, because they perceive things how they perceive it too. So, you know, it's just, a lot of stuff, city government, all that stuff come into play. But we just want to stop the conflict first before we can try to conduct business.
Why don't we give the two gentlemen a hand for that?